partnership with this organization, and I will turn it over to Derek to tell you more about their program. All yours, Derek.
Great. Thank you, Trudy. My name is Derek Malice, and I am the current president of LLI, Lifetime Learning Institute. Lifetime Learning Institute is an organization providing services for seniors. We have three primary goals. One is continuing education, classes like this collaboration with AARP. We also offer numerous socialization opportunities and also travel opportunities now that we're hopefully getting out of the pandemic. We just had our Jewels of Ireland trip in May. First of all, I want to welcome everybody from AARP. I see that we've got almost 200 people on the class, and I'd like to tell you just a few minutes about LLI and welcome AARP members attending to join us, to become members of LLI, which I describe as the best bargain in town. Our $110 annual membership is almost all inclusive. There are a few extras, of course, if you're going to Ireland or one of our trips abroad, or even our cooking classes is a small extra charge. So, but our $110 annual fee includes a number of things, including approximately 130 different classes over the course of 3 sessions during a calendar year. The courses vary from everything from our Great Decisions class, which is kind of a discussion of the geopolitical issues across the world, to history classes, cooking classes, art classes, just literature, just any number of classes, poetry classes. All of these are absolutely free to our members. We also offer a number of different, what we call special interest groups, or SIGs. These are free to attend for our members. We have interest groups on bridge, photography, mystery books, Foodies and Friends, our favorite books, tabletop games, and we're hoping to reactivate our financial discussion SIG. We also have a variety of cultural excursions. This summer, we have 3 of them scheduled. Actually, one was a week and a half ago. We went to the Gary Melcher House and Museum down in Falmouth, Virginia for a wonderful day. We've got an afternoon tea coming up on the 19th of July at the Mazadar restaurant. And we'll be visiting the Marine Corps Museum on the 24th of August. Again, there may be a slight extra charge for these excursions, entry into the venue and so forth, but everything else is covered in our membership dues. And I mentioned our study travel program. We had our Jewels of Ireland trip in May, which was our first trip abroad since the pandemic. And we're planning another one next June, a river cruise on the Danube. So all of that information is on our website, llinova.org. I will also entice you with one other class. I mentioned a number of the classes that we offer. We're offering a class that actually starts this Thursday night. It's a 3-part class. Most of ours are one-offs, although some are multi-part classes. And we're starting a class on sex after 60, beginning next Thursday. So if you're interested in any of LLI's classes, again, llinova.org. We would welcome you. We consider ourselves to be the best deal in town, and we are welcoming new members. So with that, let me turn it over to Phil, and let's start with the class.
Morning again. Welcome to all of you. And I'm here now to introduce Blane. First of all, everybody should remain muted and save your questions for the end. So you want to take notes while we're going on. So you have the questions ready at the end of the talk. So anyway, Blane Ampthor, this is his second or third class with us. He's a retired federal government employee, Philadelphia native, and has had a lifelong interest in history, particularly in World War II, ocean liners, and the American Revolution. He enjoys visiting sites related to these subjects to learn about them in greater detail. And if there's anything else you'd like to add about your bio, Blane, feel free. And off we go. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for having me for this class, and thanks for the introduction. I'm glad we have so many attendees. I hope you find this an interesting presentation. So what I'll do is highlight some famous events that we know kind of on the surface or we learned in school, but to give the details and some interesting aspects about them that you may not know or simply may have forgotten. I don't know, because I've forgotten a lot of things. And then also describe some lesser known events that were pivotal during the American Revolution, as well as to highlight some personalities who seem to be at the center of a lot of the action. So the first one we'll talk about is the Boston Massacre. And due to its high profile, the Boston Massacre can be easily seen as a single spontaneous event. However, it was actually the culmination of a series of protests and clashes. And you can see on the left there, this painting depicting one of those protests. So the setting for the massacre is that Boston troops or British troops had occupied Boston since 1768. And from the start, it was an uneasy relationship between citizens and soldiers. And tension had been increasing since the occupation, and it had been ratcheted up by people like Samuel Adams, who you see depicted in the lower right here. Now, a couple of examples of this increasing tension is that there were two publishers, Tory publishers, so they were loyalists, so they were, loyal to the British Crown. These publishers, John Mean and John Fleming, had been publishing the names of merchants who publicly supported the non-importation agreement of British goods, so it was the Townshend Acts. But they continued importing and stockpiling these products to sell in anticipation of when the Townshend Acts would expire. Now, both of these publishers, both of these men were attacked on the way to their shop and chased by a crowd of 200. Now, the person in the top right here, Royal Governor Thomas Hutchinson, who actually violated this agreement himself, the non-importation agreement, had little authority. And then another example of this increasing tension is that patriots began labeling with signs the houses and stores of merchants who would not join their cause for liberty. So this next example I'll give you has some, salty language in it, but it's actually a direct quote from one of the persons involved. So I'll read it as it was recorded. So one of these people, Ebenezer Richardson, was attacked while he was trying to remove one of these signs that the patriots had put outside houses and stores of merchants. So he was attacked while trying to remove one of these signs, and reaching his house, he shouted at the crowd, "Be the eternal God, I'll make it too hot for you before the night." Now, Patriot Thomas Knox, who was in the crowd that had chased him, replied, "Come out, you damn son of a bitch. I'll have your heart out, your liver out." After a stone was thrown through the window and struck his wife, Richardson fired his musket into the crowd, striking 11-year-old Christopher Snyder, who died that evening. In a show of propaganda, patriots organized the largest funeral to date in the colonies, with 500 school children marching 2 by 2. Okay, hold on here. Okay, I'm having a problem advancing my slides here. Okay, there we go. All right, so 4 days after the funeral for 11-year-old Christopher Snyder, citizen John.
Blane,
Yeah.
the slide did not advance. We're still seeing the same screen. I'm sorry.
Oh, you are. Okay. Okay. Hmm. Okay, do you see the cursor moving?
No, no.
Oh, hmm,
There you
okay.
go. Good.
Huh.
You fixed it. Thank you.
Do you see the screen now?
Yes,
Has the slide changed?
yes.
Okay, good. Okay, so 4 days after the funeral, citizen John Gray initiated an altercation with British soldier Patrick Walker at Gray's rope making shop. Now, Walker returned with 40 soldiers, and the sides beat each other with clubs and wooden slats. Over the next 2 days, similar events occurred. By March 5th, the day of the massacre, a foot of snow covered Boston, and by nightfall, small bands of patriots armed with clubs began patrolling the streets. So you can see this increasing tension. Around town, there were several clashes between citizens and soldiers. At the Custom House, Private Hugh White was on sentry duty. After Bostonian Edward Garrick accused White's captain, of not paying a bill, White struck him with the butt of his musket, followed him, and struck him again. When White returned to the sentry box, a crowd had gathered around him and began pelting him with snowballs, oyster shells, and chunks of ice. And you can see that depicted in this painting on the top left. Several citizens tried to disperse the crowd, but the crowd shouted at White, "Kill him, kill him, fire, damn you, fire, you dare not fire." Sensing violence, some of the crowd of 200 dispersed, leaving about 50 to 80 people. Captain Thomas Preston, who was in charge of the British Guard, arrived with additional soldiers. The crowd pressed in, and 5 Boston men were killed and 6 injured. Who fired the first shot, who was killed first, and how it all happened is still not clear. But it was not over. You would think that would be the end of it, but it was not over. A crowd of 4,000 to 5,000 colonists gathered, and all British soldiers were called out. A tense standoff followed, but was diffused by Governor Hutchinson assuring justice would take place. There was a marker for the massacre outside the State House, but it has never been in the correct location and has been moved several times to accommodate traffic. So you can see on this lower left photo here, that circle in the ground, that's this marker for the Boston Massacre. But if you look at this map in the middle of the screen, you can see here where the marker is, but the massacre actually took place down the street about a block and a half away in front of the Custom House, not in front of the State House where the marker is. So now Paul Revere created what is probably the best known depiction, kind of showing the correct location. So if you look at this top sketch here, this is the one done by Paul Revere, and the State House is in the background. Okay, it's kind of down the street. But other depictions contain accurate details, such as the soldiers standing in a circle, and which is down here in the lower right, and then with snow on the ground in the top right. So you kind of put all those depictions together, and you actually have an accurate depiction of what took place, what it actually looked like. Right. So following the massacre, the British soldiers were jailed and a trial was conducted. When John Adams became part of the defense, rocks were thrown through his house windows and he was jeered on the street. So Adams is on the top left here. So it's funny to think John Adams we associate with independence, but he was actually part of the defense team defending the British soldiers. 96 depositions were gathered from people who all claimed to be on peaceful errands on March 5th, the day of the massacre. using inconsistencies in the Patriot depositions and the account of colonist Richard Palms, who was next to Captain Preston when the first shot was fired, Adams created doubt in the jury's mind. And Adams' key witness, a Dr. John Jeffries, was on the edge of the mob, and he stated that he felt the soldiers would have fired long before they did, and that if they had not, that they would have been killed since the mob was shouting, "Kill them." Now, Captain Preston, who you see here next to Adams, who was in charge of the guard, and 6 soldiers were found not guilty. 2 soldiers were found guilty not of murder, but a lesser charge of manslaughter. And they were branded on the hand with the letter M, so all would know their guilt and there could be no future commutation. Now, interestingly, the best known victim, Crispus Attucks, who you see on the lower left here, did not become well known until before the Civil War, when his death was used as a tool for abolitionists. And it was only upon later conflict with England during the actual Revolutionary War that the massacre victims came to be enshrined as martyrs. And you can see a depiction of that here in the middle in a newspaper. Now, the victims of the Boston Massacre are buried at the Granary Burying Ground in Boston, including 11-year-old Christopher Snyder. And you see their grave right there on the right. All right, so now we move on to Paul Revere. All right, everybody knows that name. Everybody kind of knows who he is, but what do we know about him? And you see probably the best known depiction of Revere on the left. So Paul Revere's father was a silversmith to whom Paul was apprenticed. He served as an artillery second lieutenant during the French and Indian War. He built a strong business making silver products for the wealthy and lesser items for the middle class, such as shoe buckles, dog collars, spoons, and bracelets. Becoming one of the finest craftsmen in the colonies, surviving pieces are prized by museums. And you see some of those surviving pieces here in the middle. He expanded into engraving copper plates for illustrations and working with any type of metal. He was a patriot, joining many community organizations such as the Boston Committee of Correspondence, meeting people such as Samuel Adams, John Hancock, and Joseph Warren. And he made the famous engraving of the Boston Massacre that I just showed you, and helped plan the Boston Tea Party, perhaps participating in it. By 1773, he owned a horse, which was a big deal, and carried messages to various nearby towns and long trips to New York and one to Philadelphia, to where he carried word of the Boston Tea Party. And he did that trip to Philadelphia in just 11 days, round trip during the winter time. So a sign of a good rider. And he was just part of a vast warning network covering several colonies with many riders. His famous ride was an obscure event until the 50th anniversary of independence and the publication of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's famous poem in 1861, which changed parts of the story to be more effective and was used to rouse people to the cause of liberty before the Civil War. And you see Longfellow here, and then his famous book, his famous poem, Paul Revere's Ride. Now, interestingly, Longfellow and Revere had a connection, which was Longfellow's grandfather tried to court-martial Revere over his actions during an attempt in 1779 during the Revolutionary War to free Castine, Maine from the British. However, the court-martials failed. All right, so I mentioned that Revere was part of this big warning network covering many colonies. And this warning network gave him about a 2-day warning of the likely British march on Concord. So Revere's ride was not spontaneous. Revere was asked to get word to Sam Adams and John Hancock in Lexington, Massachusetts, and both of whom had previously fled Boston to avoid being captured by the British. So there were actually 3 riders involved. There was Revere, and then there was William Dawes, who you see on the lower left here, and his plan, or his ride, like Revere's, was planned. And then there was Dr. Samuel Prescott, who you see here next to Dawes, and his ride was unplanned. So Wadsworth or Longfellow's poem does not mention Dawes or Prescott. Revere informed Robert Newman of Christ Church of the needed signal, which was 2 lanterns for a sea crossing by the British. So contrary to impressions we may have, Revere had previously arranged for this signal, since, as I said, he kind of had a 2-day warning of what the British were going to do. And he previously arranged for this signal for the Patriots, not himself, because he already knew what was about to happen. Now, on the night that the British began to move, 2 friends, Thomas Richardson and Joshua Bentley, rowed him across the Charles River. And you see that depicted in the painting on the top left. He then obtained a horse from a Deacon John Larkin and started for Lexington, about 12 miles away. So Revere, even though he owned a horse, actually rode a borrowed horse, not his own. And it is possible that the horse he rode that was borrowed from that Deacon John Larkin, it's possible that Larkin had borrowed the horse from his father-in-law, so Revere may have ridden a twice borrowed horse. Now, Dawes and Revere, Dawes is here, and Revere took separate routes to get to Lexington to ensure that one of them would get there to alert that the British were coming. Now, Revere, on his ride, spotting 2 British officers, he took a different road and along the way alerted nearly every house. He did not say the British are coming, but rather he said the regulars are coming out. And you see a famous painting of him on that ride on the top right. Arriving at Lexington, he alerted Adams and Hancock, and he met Dawes there as planned. And then it was at that time that the 2 of them ran into Prescott, who was returning to his home in Concord and volunteered to alert people on his way home. Revere volunteered to join Prescott, but was captured by the British and then released. So Revere had completed his assignment of carrying a warning to Lexington, not Concord, which was not his assigned destination. Lexington was. And if you read about this, some sources state that he did not complete his ride, but he actually did, because Lexington was his assigned destination. However, after all that, he still had another job: the removal of incriminating papers from Buckman Tavern at Lexington. These papers contain records of Patriot meetings and activities, especially regarding Adams and Hancock, whom the British sought to arrest. And you see Buckman Tavern here, as it looks today, right across the street from Lexington Green. So Revere was crossing Lexington Green with the chest of papers when the fighting there began, but he continued on, completing his second assignment. Now, after the war, he continued his business, but branched into iron works, establishing his own forge. He began casting bells with his son, making about 400 of them, including one for the famous Navy ship USS Constitution. And he moved into copper sheathing for ships and supplied it for the Massachusetts State House dome. Now, if you look on the lower right here, most people probably recognize that Revere ware, which was introduced by the Revere Brass and Copper Corporation. And that carries on his name. And I know growing up, my parents had a set of that, and I still have a set of that I use daily. And its logo, which you look above there, says 1801 on it, reflects the year that Revere established his copper business. All right, so you look at that title, America Invades Canada, and you may think, well, wait a minute, did America attack Canada? Wasn't all the fighting in the colonies? Well, no, it wasn't. So the attacks on Montreal and Quebec were the first major military initiatives by the Continental Army and an attempt to eliminate the threat that the British posed being stationed in Canada. Now, the idea to attack Montreal was proposed by General Richard Montgomery, but the second expedition aimed at Quebec was proposed by Benedict Arnold. And you can see this map on the left, the attack on Montreal, which was here, and then the attack on Quebec to the northeast of Montreal. The Quebec effort was one of the epic undertakings of the war and made a name for Benedict Arnold. To make his maps for this journey, Arnold relied on the travel diary of someone interesting, British engineer Captain John Andre, the man who would help arrange his betrayal years later. Andre had made the map when he accompanied the British march down the Kennebec River from Quebec province during the French and Indian War. As was common then, two maps were made, one accurate, the other inaccurate for security reasons. Now, unfortunately, Arnold had the wrong map, which lengthened the journey. And you can see the journey that his force took here, this right-hand blue line, all the way up to Montreal. Arnold left Cambridge, Massachusetts in September 1775 with 1,100 men and arrived at Quebec with 600 men, covering 400 miles of uncharted land after following the Kennebec River and hauling their boats, called bateaux, overland and the whitewater rapids of the Chaudière River. And you can see here these two sketches of the journey, part of the journey there, and then on the top right, the soldiers hauling these bateaux over land, and the top middle is a replica of the bateau. Arnold estimated it would take 20 days to reach Quebec, but it took 51. Leaky boats ruined supplies. Equipment and supplies were lost during a freak autumn hurricane, and starvation set in, with men eating shoe leather and candle wax. Upon arriving outside Quebec, residents were astounded to see this force emerge from the forest. The American demand for surrender was rejected by British Governor Guy Carleton. Facing the expiration of enlistments at the end of the year, the Americans attacked during a snowstorm on New Year's Eve, 1775, but were soundly defeated due to poor troops, illness, and the strength of the British defensive position. And during this attack, Benedict Arnold suffered the first of 2 wounds to his left leg. A siege of Quebec followed until May of 1776, when additional British forces arrived. And this siege was ineffective due to desertions, expirations of enlistments, and disease, mostly smallpox. So when these British reinforcements arrived, the Americans retreated to Crown Point, New York, which is right here. So the Americans retreated from Quebec down to Montreal, and then the Montreal and Quebec forces retreated to Crown Point, New York. If you look on the lower right here, this marker, the course of Arnold's expedition is outlined by markers. It's a little hard to find because it was through the wilderness, but people have done it and have kind of laid it out on the internet for anybody who's interested in following that route. All right, so The British, as I had said, had occupied Boston since 1768. Now, George Washington took command of the American forces in Boston in July of 1775 and occupied Dorchester Heights, but had only a few pieces of artillery to threaten the British fleet in Boston Harbor. British forts Ticonderoga and Crown Point were captured in May 1775 by Benedict Arnold and Ethan Allen. And you see a picture there on the top left of Ticonderoga and the lower left of Crown Point. In a plan possibly conceived by Benedict Arnold, Henry Knox was selected by Washington to bring the artillery from these forts to Boston. And you see a painting of Henry Knox in the middle. Now, Henry Knox was a book dealer, not a soldier, but had read extensively on military topics, especially artillery. His father-in-law, who you see on the lower right, Thomas Flucker, was the Royal Secretary of Massachusetts. So he was a loyalist. Okay, so you had an interesting dynamic. You had Knox as a patriot and his father-in-law as a loyalist. Though most portraits, as this one does, depicts Knox as old, in 1775, he was just 25. Now, Knox's mission that was given to him by Washington was to transport 56 pieces of artillery from those two forts and the supplies to Boston on sleds during the winter when snow and cold weather would allow transportation by sled. His goal was, as he wrote to General Washington, to be able to present your excellency a noble train of artillery. This effort would cover 300 miles in 56 days, though Knox hoped it would take just 16 to 17 days under the needed cold weather. So this was December 1775 through March of 1776. The artillery was moved along Lake Champlain, across land to Lake George, and then by land again, aided by a timely 2-foot snowfall. And the artillery was placed on Dorchester Heights on March 4th, 1776, though the powder and ammunition would not arrive until several days later. So initially, placing the artillery on Dorchester Heights was a bluff by Washington, but the British left Boston on March 17th, never to return, taking some loyalists with them, including Knox's in-laws. Now, though depicted in paintings as a single caravan of artillery, the pieces actually moved in groups. And you can see a couple of the paintings here on the left. Now, portraits of this expedition invariably depict the sleds being pulled by oxen, which you can see here. However, based on Knox's diary, horses were primarily used, with a few oxen added along the way when they were available. So why is this? Why do the oxen always show up in the painting? Well, this mistake is likely due to Knox writing to Washington with the intention of using oxen before he could obtain them. And according to Knox's own diary, while negotiating to purchase these animals, a merchant quoted a very high price. So he was essentially price gouging Knox. Now, Knox submitted expenses for 520 pounds, a low cost to secure Boston. In 1926, on the 150th anniversary of Knox's march, New York and Massachusetts erected 59 historical markers that traced the route of the expedition. And you can see a map of that here. They started here at Crown Point and traveled all the way down here, and then went all the way across Massachusetts. So this part across Massachusetts was the really difficult part because it was across land and they had to cross a mountain range as well. Historian Victor Brooks called Knox's exploit of moving the artillery one of the most stupendous feats of logistics of the entire Revolutionary War. And Knox wasn't finished. He also arranged Washington's crossings of the Delaware and commanded the artillery at Yorktown. So he was involved from the start to the end of the Revolutionary War. In 1782, he became the youngest major general and was the second Secretary of War. There was a stamp issued for him, and 14 places in the US are named for him. Author Washington Irving, in his book, Life of George Washington, described Knox as one of those providential characters which spring up in emergencies, as if they were formed by and for the occasion. Now, in the top right there, you can see one of those historical markers that was placed on the Knox Trail. And in the lower right, I love this, some enterprising person has used Knox and his expedition as the basis for a moving company magnet. So the Knox Moving Company. Right, so a week ago today, we celebrated July 4th, right? Independence Day. So we know the Declaration of Independence, but do we really know what happened? So the setting is that in August 1775, a royal proclamation stated that the American colonies were engaged in open and avowed rebellion. So that's pretty strong language. I mean, there's no doubt about where the British stood on that issue. The Lee Resolution in June 1776, stating that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, was the clearest call yet for independence. On June 11, 1776, Congress appointed a committee of 5 to draft a declaration stating the case for independence. And this committee consisted of John Adams of Massachusetts, Roger Sherman of Connecticut, Robert Livingston of New York, Thomas Jefferson of Virginia, and Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania. Now, committee members convinced Jefferson to draft the document. And if you've ever seen the musical, 1776, they kind of nicely and comically portray them convincing Jefferson to write it. Now, Adams and Franklin made adjustments to Jefferson's draft text, which was then presented to Congress. And you see it being presented in this famous painting on the lower middle. On July 2nd, the Lee Resolution for Independence passed. So this was the actual vote for independence. And John Adams wrote that he believed July 2nd was the date that would be celebrated as the Great Anniversary Festival. On July 3rd and the morning of July 4th, the declaration document was revised but remained pretty much as drafted. On July 4th, this revised version of the declaration document was adopted, which is why it reads in Congress, July 4th. So the two things that did not take place on July 4th was that the vote for independence occurred or that the declaration was signed. So I always tell my kids, you know, kind of an easy bet to win if when July 4th rolls around, if they want to ask their friends what happened on July 4th, most people will say, well, the vote for independence passed or the declaration was signed, but neither of those events took place that day. Right, so what happened after July 4th? Well, actually quite a bit. The Committee of 5 was not finished because it was also responsible for printing the document. And this job fell to John Dunlap, official printer to the Congress. And you see a portrait of Dunlap on the top left. It is not known how many copies Dunlap printed on the night of July 4th, but there are 26 copies known to exist of what is called the Dunlap broadside. And these are a typeset copy, not handwritten, and do not contain any signatures. So they would look like the document on the top right. So it's a typeset copy. On July 19th, Congress ordered the document to be engrossed, which is recording it in a large, clear hand. Now, this engrossment of the document was likely done by Timothy Matlack, who had assisted Charles Thompson, Secretary of the Congress. And there's Charles Thompson. So he finished engrossing the document on August 2nd, which is the date that was fixed for the declaration to be signed. So again, it was not signed on July 4th, but rather August 2nd. And why did the men sign where they did? Well, the signatures were arranged geographically. So you can see Georgia here, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, and so on up to New England. Eventually, 56 delegates signed it, with 5 signing later after the August 2nd date, and 2 people never signing it. And those 2 people were John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, who hoped for reconciliation with Britain, and Robert Livingston, who ironically was one of the committee of 5 charged with writing the document. And he never signed it because he felt the declaration was premature. Years later, the newly created position of Secretary of State was charged with the preservation of all records. So appropriately, the declaration returned to the first Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, the man who drafted it. In 1814, when the British attacked Washington, D.C. during the War of 1812, it was moved to an unused grist mill in Virginia, 2 miles from Georgetown, then to Leesburg, Virginia, before returning to D.C. And except for the 1876 centennial in Philadelphia, and during World War II, the declaration has been in D.C. Now, the document began to age and fade due to being rolled and unrolled. From 1841 to 1876, it was displayed in the patent office, exposed to sunlight for easy viewing, and subject to various temperatures and humidity levels. And several writers noted the deterioration in the document, such as United States Magazine noted that old-looking paper with the fading ink. And in 1873, the Historical Magazine published an official statement by Mortimer Leggett, Commissioner of Patents, who admitted that many of the names on the declaration are already illegible. And you can see here on the bottom what it looks like today, right? It's pretty faded. And on the right, you can see John Hancock's signature as it looks today. And below, if it were restored, or what it looked like when it was actually signed. So you can see there's a huge difference in the condition of the document. In 1877, it was placed in the State Department library, where smoking was allowed, and there was a fireplace nearby. And you can see that display there on the left. However, it was safer there, considering that the Patent Office building was gutted by a fire within a few months of the declaration being moved out of it. From 1924 to 1941, it was displayed in a proper case at the Library of Congress, which you see in the top middle. In 1941, it was moved to Fort Knox for safety during World War II. And on the right, you see a photo of them packaging the declaration for its journey to Fort Knox. In 1944, it was returned to the Library of Congress until 1952, when it was moved to its present location at the National Archives building. Okay, so we all recognize this painting of Washington crossing the Delaware. But what do we actually know about it? So this painting was created by a German painter, Emanuel Lutz, who you see on the lower right. He was born in Germany. His family immigrated to the US when he was 10 years old, but he returned to Germany to study painting. The purpose of the painting was to capture the spirit of liberty through the American Revolution and to inspire German freedom. So it was not meant to be accurate, but to be inspirational. Now, Lutz began painting it in 1849, but it was damaged by a fire in 1850. He repaired the damage, but it was destroyed in a 1942 British air raid during World War II. Well, geez, okay, the painting's gone, but how come we still have it? Well, fortunately, Lutz had created a copy of the painting, and this is the one that survives. And if you look at the painting, there are several inaccuracies, such as the flag here did not exist until 6 months after this event of Washington crossing the Delaware. State or military unit flags were typically used, and the boats that are depicted here are wrong, and I'll talk about those in a little bit. And it appears to be day, but the crossing took place at night. And the Delaware was just forming new ice. So there were no ice chunks as shown in the painting. And the river is wider than the actual point of the crossing. And if you look at this person right here, that's Lieutenant James Monroe, future president of the US. And he is the only other person standing besides Washington. However, Monroe did not cross with Washington, but was with a different unit, the 3rd Virginia Regiment. The painting toured major cities of the US in the early 1850s, drawing huge crowds. It was exhibited in New York City and purchased for $10,000 in 1851, which was a huge sum of money. Other authorized copies are displayed at Purdue University, at Washington Crossing Historic Park, and in the White House. And the painting, which you see on the top right, remember this is the copy that had been made. The painting has been at the New York City Metropolitan Museum of Art since 1897. So, Washington crossed the Delaware, but why did he do it, and how did it actually happen? So the setting is, by the end of 1776, the Continental Army had suffered a series of defeats in New York and had been chased by the British Army across New Jersey. When Washington reached the Delaware River, his force had been reduced to 4,000 to 6,000 soldiers, 1,700 of whom were unfit for duty. And when he reached the Delaware, the Army crossed into Pennsylvania on December 2nd, 1776. Now, in addition to having a greatly reduced force, Washington also faced desertions and the expiration of enlistments at the end of the year. On December 20th, the arrival of additional troops from the Hudson River Valley improved his force. So remember that the arrival of those troops from the Hudson River Valley, because that's going to figure into another story I'll tell you. The British, rightly confident that the Americans were nearly beaten, retreated to winter quarters at a chain of outposts across New Jersey, including Trenton and Princeton. Washington sought some sort of bold action to improve his situation. His final plan called for crossing the river at 4 points, with the main crossing at McConkey's Ferry, which is just north of Trenton. However, the other crossings did not occur due to the extreme weather and the lack of troops. So I mentioned that the boats in the painting were wrong. So the boats that were actually used was this type here, which were called Durham boats, and they were cargo vessels. And you can see here, one of those boats photo taken during the annual reenactment of the crossing on Christmas Day. And then one of the boats in the shed there at Washington Crossing Park on the lower left. So you can see they were cargo vessels, right? Different from the boats in the painting. And they were rowed using huge oars, such as the ones here by these reenactors, again, on the annual reenactment on Christmas Day. And the troops did not sit as depicted in the painting, but they stood. And you can see here that there's no room for them to sit. And as shown in this photo on the top left, they are standing. And in addition to these Durham boats, barges were used to transport artillery, horses, supplies, and additional troops. And you can see that on the top right painting. You know, friends and I were there several years ago to tour the park. We were walking around with the ranger, and he says, he points to this bridge here on the lower right, and he says he likes to ask tour groups, especially if they had children in them, why didn't they just use the bridge to cross the Delaware? So, and he asked that just to see what kind of reaction he gets. So I thought that was a great story. Right, so Washington's plan that he finally came up with, it was bold, it was daring, and it called for complex coordination, a high goal for the inexperienced and exhausted troops during a bad winter storm. So he had a lot of things working against him. A bold plan, it was complex. He had inexperienced and exhausted troops and trying to do all this during a bad winter storm. You know, you can see the route that he took. So the crossing at McConkey's Ferry here, and then the march south to Trenton, where the forces split so they could attack Trenton from two directions. Now, the Hessian commander, so at Trenton, who fell under British command, Colonel Rawl, had warnings of the attack, but disregarded them as well as instructions from his superior, British General Howe, to dig in and prepare for an attack. And Colonel Rawl responded to General Howe, "Let them come, we'll at them with the bayonet." The logistics of the crossing were given to Henry Knox. Remember him, who had hauled the cannons from Fort Ticonderoga a year earlier. The weather worsened during the day. Freezing rain changed to sleet and then to snow. As the crossing and the march fell behind schedule, Washington seriously considered calling it off. And on the top right here is a painting called March to Trenton. Now, a misconception is that the Hessian Colonel Rawl was sleeping in and not reacting to the attack. But the truth is that he organized his troops, fought bravely, and was wounded and died 30 hours later. And another misconception is that most Hessian troops were drunk and sleeping in. But the truth is that they responded quickly to the attack and fought well. And you can see a painting of the attack on the lower right. After the battle, Washington crossed back into Pennsylvania, one made more difficult due to 1,000 prisoners, captured horses, cannon, weapons, and supplies, and some American troops drunk on captured rum. So it was some Americans who were drunk, not the Hessians. On December 29th, Washington recrossed the river, this time at 8 points, to join a force which had crossed 2 days earlier to repulse the expected British counterattack coming from Princeton, which was north of Trenton. A recent snow followed by bitter cold allowed some troops to actually walk across a frozen Delaware River. So if you were counting, in the end, Washington crossed the Delaware not once, but 4 times. Quite a remarkable achievement. All right, so you look at that title, Benedict Arnold, America's Greatest Soldier, you think, okay, what am I talking about? But I'll tell you the story. The general impression of Arnold is of a dastardly traitor, which is true, but there is much more to his story that may change your view of him. His great-grandfather had succeeded Roger Williams as president of the Rhode Island colony, and he was fearless. As a teenager, he challenged a local sheriff to a fist fight and later engaged in multiple duels. He made his money by running a general store and, like many contemporaries, by smuggling. He acquired a partnership in merchant vessels and sailed the East Coast and to the Caribbean. And this is when he gained valuable sailing experience that would play a significant role later in the war. Washington considered him his fighting general. Contemporaries called him America's Hannibal for his extraordinary journey to Quebec in 1775 that I described earlier. And even British Secretary of State, Lord Germain, described Arnold as the most enterprising and dangerous of all the American generals. So he was a big deal. Now, he was twice wounded in his left leg, first at Quebec and then at the Battle of Saratoga. And you see a painting on the right of him wounded at Quebec. Feeling he did not get the recognition he deserved for his successes, he resigned from the army in 1777, but rejoined later that year in time to contribute significantly to the American victory at Saratoga. Now, at the Saratoga battlefield is a statue commemorating his leg, but it does not mention his name or show his body. And you can see that statue here in the center. It's kind of informally known as the boot statue. So it's kind of an odd thing, but there it is on the battlefield. His wounds, which left him with a permanent limp and his left leg 2 inches shorter than the other, rendered him unable to serve any longer. So he was appointed military governor of Philadelphia, where his loyalties began to change. Ironically, he lived in the same house used by British General Howe during the city's occupation by the British Army. He used his position for personal profit and married the daughter, Peggy Shippen, who you see on the lower left, of a suspected loyalist. Arnold was court-martialed in 1780 on 13 counts of misbehavior, but acquitted of all but 2 minor charges. Debt and resentment at not being promoted by Congress led to Arnold's betrayal by planning to hand over the plans for the fort at West Point, New York, in exchange for a British command and money of which he never received the full amount. Now, after the failed attempt to hand over the fort at West Point, Arnold escaped on a British ship appropriately named HMS Vulture. And you can see a sketch on the top left of Arnold coming aboard HMS Vulture. After Arnold's betrayal, residents of Philadelphia created a two-faced effigy of him down the streets. And you see that on the top center. Newspapers compared him to Lucifer and Judas, and the Continental Congress passed a resolution permanently erasing him from the Army Register. After the defection, Washington implemented a plan to capture Arnold and make a public example of him. The plan nearly succeeded, but on the night it was to occur, Arnold was called away to serve in another unit. Now, he lived most of the rest of his life in England, which was ambivalent to him. The British viewed him as a mercenary and responsible for the death of the heroic Major John Andre, his accomplice. 5 of Arnold's sons became officers in the British Army. He was buried without military honors. His grave is located at St. Mary's of Battersea Church in London. And you see that church here on the lower left. And his grave is adjacent to a child care center. So you see right here his crypt, okay? And you have these photos that the kids made here, and it's next to a fish tank. So kind of an odd arrangement. Despite this apparent disregard, there is a stained glass window dedicated to him in the church. So just the next level up from his crypt. And you see that window here on the right. So very elaborate. And if you look at the top right, a plaque to Arnold at the old cadet chapel at West Point, where names of Revolutionary War generals are displayed, has his name removed, just as Major General. Now, Arnold provided perspective on his situation at the Battle of Saratoga, when shot in the same leg as he had been shot in at Quebec. An officer rushed up to him and asks where he's been shot. Arnold responded, in the leg, but adds, I wish it had been my heart. So now we move on to the Battle of Valcour Island. So most people are unaware of this battle, and be honest, until about 10 years ago, I was one of those people. So it's a little known battle, but it was one of the first naval engagements of the war by the Americans. And this took place in October 1776. And it was one of the truly decisive battles of the war, likely saving the American cause. So the setting is that in 1776, the British sought to divide the colonies along the Hudson River by attacking from the north and the south and meeting at Albany. So you can see here, they wanted to use the Hudson River to attack from the north, heading south, and then troops from New York City to come up the Hudson and for the two forces to meet right here at Albany. So separating the New England colonies from the rest of the colonies. Benedict Arnold, having retreated from Quebec, if you remember that, to Fort Ticonderoga earlier in the year, was charged with building a fleet to stop the coming British attack down Lake Champlain. So here's Lake Champlain. So because he was charged with building a fleet, Arnold can be considered the true father of the American Navy, because he built this fleet at Skenesboro, which is today's Whitehall, New York, which itself can be regarded as the birthplace of the American Navy. Arnold built a fleet of 16 ships, and the British built 25 ships at St. John, Newfoundland, or St. John, Canada. So you kind of had this arms race going on, right? Americans building ships because they knew the British were going to attack down the lake, and the British building the ships to execute this attack. Now, with the approach of winter and the traditional seasonal ending of military campaigning, Arnold realized all he had to do was delay the British in order to foil their plan. So the plan Arnold came up with was to hide his fleet, manned mostly by soldiers, not sailors, on the west side of Valcour Island, forcing the British to fight in a confined area and to come at him against the wind. So you can see this map here. The Americans are in the blue here, and then the British had to come down the lake and come around the south end of Valcour Island and go and sail against the wind, which in the age of sail was a difficult thing to achieve. And on the lower left, you can see a modern day photo of Valcour Island, and the red arrow is the approach of the British fleet, which had to swing around the south end. And the blue box is where Arnold hid his fleet. So you can see it was a confined area. Now, the battle, which resulted, was a slugfest, and it lasted from late morning until dusk, ending only when the British had nearly run out of ammunition and night had arrived. And you can see two paintings on the right depicting this battle. The remaining American ships escaped at night aided by a providential fog and a moonless night, slipping past the British ships using muffled oars. Once the British discovered the next morning that the Americans had escaped, a two-day running battle began as the British pursued the escaping American ships. And the remaining American ships reached Ferris Bay, where they were stripped and burned. Now, Ferris Bay was renamed Arnold Bay and is the only place in America named for him. And you can see right here where Arnold Bay is. So it's at the south end of Lake Champlain. Now, Arnold's men then marched to Fort Crown Point, burned it, then marched on to Fort Ticonderoga. When British Governor Guy Carleton reached Crown Point, it had begun to snow and he retreated to Canada for the winter. Now, had the British been able to continue south, it likely would have been the end of the war. So this battle, though it's pretty much unknown, had several big implications. It forced the British to retreat to Canada for the winter, providing a full year's respite for the Americans in the region until their victory 11 months later at the Battle of Saratoga. And it allowed the Americans to reorganize and increase the army size in the area. And it removed the British threat that the British posed to Fort Ticonderoga, allowing 2,000 troops to be sent to General Washington. And these are the troops that I mentioned arrived from Hudson River Valley that were used in the Christmas Day strike at Trenton. Now, Arnold was the first commander of an American fleet, but is likely not recognized because, for the obvious reason that he was a traitor, but also because he was actually defeated in the battle, and the battle took place on a lake, not on the open ocean, so it may not have been as, grand. But the story of Valcour Island did not end when the battle was finished. Many of the ships sunk in the battle remain on the lake bottom, preserved by the cold water. And the most famous one is the gunboat Philadelphia, currently at the Smithsonian's Museum of American History. And you see that on the top left. In 1935, Colonel Lorenzo Hagelin, a World War I veteran and later a Marine engineer, located and salvaged the Philadelphia. You see that top center photo there of him actually salvaging the gunboat. Now, Colonel Hagelin and later his widow tried to find a home for the gunboat, but they were turned down by Fort Ticonderoga, the Navy Department, the Army Department, and the city of Philadelphia. So eventually, Mrs. Hagelin gifted the gunboat in her will to the Smithsonian, who accepted it in 1960. And you can see in this photo on the top right, the gunboat being moved into the Museum of American History as it's still being constructed. A replica of the Philadelphia is on display at the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum, and you see that on the lower left. So that's the famous gunboat. But 3 years before finding the Philadelphia, Hagelin found and salvaged the American ship Royal Savage, which you see depicted in this sketch on the lower middle. It was sold to the city of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and later sent to the Naval History and Heritage Command's laboratory at the Washington, D.C. Navy Yard. And in 1997, another gunboat, the Spitfire, was located and is in pristine condition, still on the bottom of the lake. And you see a painting of that on the lower right. Yeah, if you look on the top left photo, most people are familiar with that. The tomb of the unknown soldier at Arlington National Cemetery, which has soldiers from World War I, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. However, there are similar memorials for soldiers of the Revolutionary War. And we'll start in the middle here. And this is the tomb of the unknown soldier of the Revolutionary War. And it's located in Washington Square in Philadelphia, just a few blocks from Independence Hall. And that was completed in 1957. And you move to the top right, which is the old Presbyterian Meeting House burial ground in Alexandria, Virginia. And that was completed in 1929. And if you move to the lower left, that's the tomb of the unknown Revolutionary War soldiers in Rome, New York. You know, bodies were found while excavating sewer and telephone lines, and it was determined that the bodies were those who served at Fort Stanwix, and that memorial was dedicated in 1976. And on the bottom right is the tomb of the unknown patriot, which is in Boulevard, Ohio, which is south of Cleveland. And that's located at Fort Lawrence, which was the only Revolutionary War fort in Ohio. And that opened in 1917. Though the Revolutionary War and the American Revolution are core to our nation's founding, many of the events composing them are not understood or even known. Though we may need to search a bit to find them, we should be grateful that many reminders of these momentous events still exist as a way to recognize the extraordinary people and events which changed the course of history. Right. Well, that concludes the presentation. So if there are any questions, I'd be happy to attempt to answer them.
Hi, Blane. That was outstanding. Wow. Yes, there were lots of questions in the chat.
Okay.
So I think I might take them in order from
Okay.
the beginning. A lot of them are just greetings. Let's see. You've done an exhaustive amount of research. Slides are excellent. Wow, learned a lot. Okay, let's see. The audio was kind of choppy at times. It was like you were speaking very slowly. And then, so I don't know what that was. Anyway, let's see.
Bill, I
The
noticed
question-
this,
yes?
it's Trudy. I noticed one of the questions was, I think it was General Knox. Is that the same person that Fort Knox is named after?
Yes, it is.
Okay, there you go. Another question, was there some sort of Central Patriot Command or Committee of Congress who worked out an overall strategy for winning the War of Independence, or was this left open to generals in the field?
No, there really wasn't. From Congress, there really wasn't a central strategy. They were Congress was kind of, indecisive, really was mostly not fully aware of the conditions that exist in various parts of the colonies where the troops were fighting. So a lot of it was left to George Washington, who was, appointed commander of the Continental Army, and to figure out what to do. So, a lot of things haven't changed, but lots of times Congress might react after the fact or overreact or ignore him. But there's many accounts of him writing letter after letter to them saying, we really need supplies. We really need this. We need that. The troops have not been paid. And that was a big issue. So, technically, I guess it should have been Congress, but at that time, the fighting and the idea of independence was new, and everybody's grappling with it. But Washington was the main source of the strategy.
Thank you. Question, were we fighting both the British and the Germans, the Hessians?
Yeah, so the Hessians were, the German Hessians, they were hired by the British to supplement their troops in America, because British were, spread across the globe and were also involved in other military actions. So, what started out in the colonies as a kind of an uprising, obviously expanded, so they needed additional help. So what was it? I think I have the story right. The cousin of King George III was in the German royalty, so he was able to kind of work out a deal to hire these troops to fight on behalf of the British.
Wow. Wow. As somebody pointed out, like the Wagner Group right now in Ukraine, hired by Russia. Same idea.
Yeah, kind of like that. Yeah. And these were professional soldiers, the Hessians were. So they were, highly regarded.
Did revolutionary soldiers refuse medals because that was a British thing?
Oh, can you repeat that? I'm sorry.
Did revolutionary soldiers refuse medals because that was a British tradition, whatever?
No. In fact, during the Revolutionary War, Washington began the Purple Heart Award. He initiated that. And there were other means of recognition. It may have been some medals, but a lot of it was, formal recognition or an increase in rank, things like that. Yeah. And again, this army was new and
Ragtag.
a lot of militia, but eventually over time, a corps of soldiers, but they were still from different colonies. So you had a Virginia regiment or, Georgia regiment, things like that.
Why didn't the British attack the Americans from the north at Valcour Island rather than circle around the island and attack from the south?
Yeah, so that's a good question, but it's because the north end of the island there was very shallow. And so the ships could not pass over. It was kind of a rocky area, so they couldn't pass through there. So Arnold knew that. So he said, the only way they can get to me is coming from south around the island.
How did the British get their ships onto Lake Champlain?
Well, they built some of them there farther up, but they actually had some ships, a number of them that they had designed in England to be easily taken apart and
Portage or
reassembled.
whatever. Okay.
Yeah, so they actually shipped them over here, and then they could transport them unassembled over to Lake Champlain and then assemble. So it was a huge effort. Yeah,
Wow.
very creative.
Yes.
I think I mentioned, may I cut in there?
Sure, go ahead.
I mentioned on the chat that my ancestor is John Adams. My father's mother's maiden name is Adams, and she's a direct line to Henry, which is John Adams' second great-grandfather. And Henry is my 9th great-grandfather, direct.
Wow.
Yeah, and my grandmother, she looked just like John Adams, short, squatty. The face was amazing. Anyway, a lot of these stories are from, I belong to the DAR, Daughters of the American Revolution. And we get the magazine, American Spirit. And most what he was talking about, Blane, are in this magazine. And it's a wealth, just a wealth of information. It's fabulous. So I'm so happy to belong to the Daughters of American Revolution.
Yeah.
So does anyone else have joined DAR?
Nope.
They have 3,000, I believe, 3,000 units.
This is Dolores
Wow.
Cooper. Dolores Cooper. I do plan to join. I have a relative that Afro-American relative that fought in the revolution. So I do plan to pursue joining.
Oh, do. It's fabulous. You'll enjoy it. The ladies are great. Wealth of information. So please, if you have to join within your city. I'm in Scottsdale, Arizona, and we have, excuse me, I believe 5 different ones. Scottsdale has their own group. Tucson has their own group, et cetera, et cetera. So find one in your area.
Yeah, I'm in Virginia Beach, Virginia, so I
Oh.
appreciate that feedback. I thought it was just a broad, group.
No,
Across. Okay,
yeah, good luck.
thank
Super.
you.
Thank
You're
you.
welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing.
You're welcome.
Let's see. And Debbie asks that we take a brief survey. It's right there in the chat from ARP to share feedback. Lots of nice compliments. Where is the large marker of unknown soldiers with the Washington statue located, Blane?
Oh, in Philadelphia.
In
It's
Philadelphia.
just a few blocks from Independence Hall. Yeah, it's in Washington Square.
Oh, okay. And somebody asked about the recording. And yes, if you registered with ARP, you will receive the link to the recording. And if you're with LLI, same, you'll also be able to revisit or share with others. Lots of nice compliments. AARP Virginia rocks with the best programs. Okay. Rah, rah, rah. Okay, Cynthia, to everyone, are you giving any lectures in Philadelphia in person or online about the American Revolution? That's to Blane.
Oh, no, I don't have
Okay,
any plans. Yeah, I just pretty much do this locally to where I am in Virginia.
great.
To those, may I cut in?
Sure.
To those that want to join DAR, I found it quite easy because when I contacted the group, they send over someone that can connect you, follow your line to prove that you are daughter of the American Revolution. You have to have that document, and they'll do that. They'll help you with that, and then you are invited into the group. So there you go.
Hi, yes, this is Dolores again. So with the I knew that you had to prove that, but with the document, they send you a document that has all of the information that you need to prove it. Is that correct?
Yes, yes.
Okay,
Yes.
thank you.
Good luck again.
At this time, didn't England or Great Britain control most of Europe and were really shocked at our attempts at independence? Blane?
Yeah, they were. I mean, it kind of took a while to sink in, I guess, with England, but there was, I mean, here in America, there was a large loyalist contingent, and as they would explain it, it makes sense that they said, well, we're part of the British Empire. It's pretty stable. We have certain rights and things like that. So the idea of independence was kind of, well, it was radical, and the idea of self-government. So so they were but eventually in Parliament, as the war went on, and other fighting that the British Empire was doing, and their treasury was being depleted, that eventually a lot of them kind of came around to kind of, I guess, support it, but not be opposed to it. It's kind of a slight difference, but a lot of in Parliament, the opinions started to shift and say, oh, okay, well, maybe we should just kind of let them be and focus on other things. And the idea of self-government was starting to take hold in other places too. So, but it took like 10 years or so for that shift to occur, and some of Parliament's thinking. Yeah, so the continuation of the fighting and deployment of troops and all that involved with the Revolutionary War really the popularity of it really diminished.
Thank you. The Gishes say in Edinburgh, Scotland, there's a plaque on the door of a townhouse occupied by Benedict Arnold, characterizing him as a great American patriot.
Well, he was.
Yeah, well, he was, yes.
As hopefully I got that point across, but yeah, he was. So except for the betrayal at the end, he
Right.
was
I
quite,
didn't know it.
he was a big player and rightfully so. I mean, he was quite accomplished and capable.
The point of that comment was it depends upon your point of view.
Point of view, right.
One person's patriot is another person's
Rebel. Yeah.
traitor.
Traitor.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Right.
we were on a tour bus and I saw that, you know, and I looked and I did a double take. Wait a minute, he's a traitor. No, not in Edinburgh, Scotland. He's not a
Right,
traitor.
Right, right.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's just like up until that point, he had quite a number of accomplishments and you know, and strongly supported the American fighting or the American cause. But in the end, you know, the betrayal brought on by a number of factors. So.
Well,
Well,
the French helped us. I mean, we promised them money to bring their soldiers over to help in the south part of the United States, the colonies. And we promised payment, which we never paid because we were bankrupt. So John and I went to Europe, to France, stayed in Paris area, but we rented not a townhouse, but one of the hunting lodges. And we met an elderly couple that was celebrating the 50th wedding anniversary. And John speaks French, and they were talking, and we told him that our fathers fought in World War II. And he leaned over and he patted John on the knee. He says, "You thanks your papa for saving our Paris, and to me too." And so I took that back to my father, and he was just surprised, shocked. So that's, you know, we helped them later on in life.
Yeah, and I've been to Normandy a couple of times, but and that's, you know, a different setting than
Right,
some
right.
different.
But they remember
Yeah.
these.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, the sense of
They know these.
appreciation is palpable there, and a lot of the houses fly 4 flags, you know, French, US, Canadian, and British. Yeah, so it's so there's a great continuing appreciation for their liberation during World War II.
We have several more questions, comments. I'm not sure.
I'm sorry, I have to leave, but this was wonderful. Thank you so much for putting this together.
Oh, you're
really
welcome.
appreciate
Thank
it.
you.
My pleasure.
Okay.
I learn a lot
Bye.
too, but thank you for your DAR recommendations.
Information. Mhm.
Well, it's even in Europe, DAR's in Europe, because they fought in the American Revolution.
Oh, okay. Oh, interesting.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.
Judy Flynn says, before Benedict Arnold became a traitor, it sounds like he was very effective and useful. So why wasn't he more recognized and promoted?
That's part of the mystery of him. A lot of it was Congress, because he wasn't promoted by Congress. Washington recommended him several times. Anyway, I mean, he was promoted a few grades, but Washington continued to recommend him for higher ranks, but for whatever reason, Congress didn't do it, didn't promote him to those ranks. And some of it was, there was kind of a lot of intrigue with him, and there's a lot of personal, within Congress, there's a lot of personal whatever. I don't want to say vendettas, but
Mhm, mhm.
that type of thing where they were just like, wow, I don't like that person, so I'm going to vote against that. And not just him, but other people as well. So there's a lot of behind the scene operations, but I mean, he was certainly recognized by Washington, who commanded the army, and many he certainly recognized him as vital and called on him many times to perform some pretty tough tasks.
Okay, I think we're going to stop right there because we're just about out of time. I certainly appreciate the incredible amount of attendees that came and the comments, all the compliments at the end. Just lovely. Just speaks to your research, the wonderful slides you put together, and just how you presented all this wealth of a material that really opens our eyes to lots of things we didn't know before, and that's the whole purpose.
Yes. Well,
So-
I learned a lot in the process too. So
There you go.
Thanks for the
Okay.
opportunity.
Trudy, do you have any parting comments?
No, I just want to thank everyone for joining us today. Blane, as always, fantastic job, and I look forward to working with you both on the AARP side and on the LLI side as well. So thanks for joining us today.
Excellent.
You're absolutely welcome. Thank you. My
Thank you.
pleasure.
I'm going to shut it down for everybody. Thanks again for
Phil?
coming.
Phil,
All right.
Is that Derek?
Bye-bye.
What was that? Derek?
AARP.
Can't hear you. The audio is not cooperating.
Uh-oh. I'm off mute, so anyway, just briefly wanted to thank AARP very much. In case anybody can hear me. I think I saw 227 folks on there. I wanted to thank Blane very much for a wonderful presentation. Thank you, Phil, for coordinating. And once again, just urge any of our AARP guests to consider joining LLI. An easy matter to access our classes, our cultural excursions, trips, our special interest groups, all at llinova.org. Thank everyone for attending.
Thank you. I'm going to shut it down for now. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.